we should start if that's okay. Dr. Simkovich, are you okay with that?
I am. I am.
Okay, great. So I'm not Rabbi Lisa Green. I'm Rabbi Wendy Geffen. I am here in her place as she is at the Central Conference of American Rabbis annual convention with 500 other Reform rabbis in Philadelphia, which meant I get to be here tonight, which I'm so excited about. And hopefully you have all been here for at least one, if not more, of what I've heard have been amazing sessions by Dr. Simkovich. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to her and we'll catch back up on the back end.
That sounds great, Rabbi Geffen. Thank you so much for being here. I know you have a very busy schedule, and thanks to all of you for being with me this evening and being part of this learning community for the past month. It's been a joy. And before I forget, I'm going to put my email address into the chat so that if you have any questions in the future, burning questions about the origins of anti-Judaism, you'll know where to reach me. So before we begin tonight's talk, which wraps up the 4-week session, it had anti-Judaism in the title, but we did much more than talk about anti-Judaism. I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to provide some kind of brief summation of the past 3 weeks, and then we'll dive into tonight's talk. So we began week 1 with a review of what scholars call common Judaism. And the question that we started with was, what kept Jews together as they began to spread throughout the world in the late 6th century BCE, when the Babylonian exile comes to an end and Persia defeats Babylon in 539 BCE, Jews are spreading and spreading and spreading. What keeps them together? And what keeps them together, we said, was 3 markers of Jewish practice: Shabbat, Sabbath, and we could add the calendar, holidays to that, circumcision of the sons, dietary laws. These are the 3 main practices of Jewish identity in the ancient world. But really above that, and I remember using a very bad metaphor, that's the cake of Judaism, and the frosting above it is the regular reading and interpretation of the scriptures. And I don't say canon because we don't have a closed book yet until maybe the 2nd or 3rd century CE, but we have scriptures, we have authoritative texts. The Jews are reading their Pentateuch, their Torah, they're reading their prophets. And then the 3rd section of the Hebrew Bible, the writing section, is still kind of open. But these are what Jews are doing all over the world. It doesn't matter where they are, whether they're in proximity to the Jerusalem temple, or they're in Alexandria in Egypt, or Antioch in Syria, or to the east, along the Euphrates. They're doing these things. So that was week 1. Week 2, we explored anti-Jewish texts that begin in the 4th or 3rd century BCE with Egyptian priests such as Manetho, but then it really gets going with the Greek literature in 2nd century BCE, and we looked at some Roman texts as well. And so we found some tropes that are resonant for our contemporary times. We found texts that condemn Jews as being particularist, misanthropic, insular, legalistic. All those things are going to become very important in the 3rd century and 4th century as the early Christian church fathers begin to separate or push that separation of Christianity away from Judaism. But all these tropes exist before the rise of Christianity. So we find them very prominently, actually, in the Hellenistic era that precedes the rise of Christianity. So that was week 2. Last week, we talked about intra-Jewish relations, and we focused on this particular dynamic between Jews who lived in the land of Israel and Jews who lived in Egypt. And we looked specifically at the Judean Jewish perspective. So we looked at literature that came out of the land of Israel, and we saw this kind of exceptionalism, this self-understanding of Jews in the land of Israel who really wanted Jews outside the land of Israel to express fealty, to express loyalty, commitment to the temple in Jerusalem and to the people who administered it. And they wanted Egyptian Jews to show that loyalty by observing the holiday of Hanukkah. So we looked at those 2 fascinating letters in which leaders in Jerusalem send emails. They didn't send emails. They sent actual letters. They sent mail they sent letters to leaders in Alexandria asking Jews in Egypt to observe the purification holiday, which later in the rabbinic era becomes known as Hanukkah. So we discussed common Judaism, anti-Judaism, and intra-Jewish relations. And one thing that I think I did not sufficiently highlight, which I really want to repeat in case it wasn't made clear, is that all the tropes that you find in anti-Jewish literature, again, that Jews are barbaric, misanthropic, separatists, these tropes are not targeting sectarian Jewry. We didn't really talk about the sects of Judaism so much. I think I discussed it very briefly in the first class, where you have Essenes and Pharisees and Sadducees. And if you read, I don't know if you've read the New Testament, but if you have, you would see that they figure very prominently in the New Testament. And if you're very familiar with the New Testament, you might think that these sectarian communities are really prominent and most Jews in the ancient world were in a sect, but that's not the case. The vast majority of Jews are actually not in a sect. At any point in time in the Second Temple period, we have numbers from Josephus. There are 6,000 Pharisees, 4,000 Essenes, and 3,000 Sadducees, and so that's a very, very small percentage. And when you have Egyptians and Greeks and Romans who are writing anti-Jewish literature, they're actually not particularly interested in these sectarian groups. They're targeting all Jews, even those in the diaspora. And these Jews observe common Judaism. So there really isn't escaping it. I mean, yes, you have assimilated Jews, but if you're an observant Jew anywhere in the Hellenistic world, and you keep Sabbath, circumcision, and dietary law, your life as a Jew who practices common Judaism and not sectarian Judaism will be subject to profound criticism by your by some of your Greek and Roman neighbors. And I think this is an important point because we might assume that they were targeting the extreme Jews or the most overtly insular Jews, but no, they were just targeting sort of the baseline observant Judaism, the common Judaism that we explored in class 1. And I think that that's something pretty significant to think about. So tonight, we're going to look at diasporan Jewish literature. And this is kind of going to mirror what we did last week. Last week, we looked at this intra-Jewish relationship between Jews in the land of Israel and Egypt, but we focused on that Judean literature. And now we're going to ask the question, how did Jews in the diaspora respond? And we're going to look at a few texts that suggest that diasporan Jews, especially Jews who were living in Egypt, there were about 1 million Jews living in Egypt in the 1st century BCE, so a huge population, the biggest population of Jews outside the land of Israel in the Hellenistic era was Egypt. And these are Greek-speaking Jews, very sophisticated, especially those Jews who are living in the vicinity of Alexandria, and they're exposed to philosophy and Greek literature. And these are Jews who are walking the tightrope of wanting to participate in public civic life of their host empire, but they also really observed and identified as Jews very proudly. Now, these Jews who are very sensitive to what their Judean kin are saying in the land of Israel are also sensitive to what Greeks and Romans are saying about them. So these Jews have it tough in 2 ways. They're doubly marginalized. Their Greek and Roman neighbors are saying, you're too insular. Why aren't you going to the festival of Dionysus? Why aren't you participating in our public festivals? Why are you staying home on these big days? And then you are observing your own holidays to this God that chose only you and nobody else. So they're subject to this criticism. We looked at it 2 weeks ago. And they're also receiving letters from their kin in the land of Israel with this kind of maybe gentler critique, asking the Egyptian Jews to show more overt loyalty to them. And so both populations, right, Greeks and Romans on the one hand, and Jews in the land of Israel on the other, are really accusing diaspora Jews of one thing, and that's improper loyalty. The Greeks and Romans are saying, you're too loyal to Jerusalem and the temple. Maybe drop those ancestral traditions that highlight the Jerusalem temple and focus on the temple of Jupiter, let's say, in Rome. And Jews in the land of Israel are saying the same thing. You're not properly expressing your loyalty, which should primarily be directed towards us. And so tonight we're going to look at some of the texts that were produced by Jews in Egypt who are very sensitive, again, to both of these accusations, and want to maintain and cultivate really genuine and substantive relationships with both of these groups, their Hellenistic neighbors and their kin in the land of Israel. We're going to see a spectrum of responses. We're going to start with what I think is probably the most optimistic text that we have on this question in the ancient world. And then sadly, after I made my source sheet, I was like, maybe I should have gone from most negative to most positive, and then we could end the series on a high note. But for whatever reason, I started with the happiest and the most optimistic, and then I sort of slide down into a much gloomier attitude towards the question of Greek-Jewish relations and intra-Jewish relations. So you'll see we're sort of sliding into pessimism, but we'll try to still end the series on a high note. And before I go on, I want to ask all of you if you have access to the source sheet. It starts with the letter of Aristeas, goes on to Philo. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, good. Thank you for nodding. All right. So have I talked to you yet about the letter of Aristeas? Did I mention it? Okay, this is a delightful text. It's a text produced in the late 2nd century BCE, and it recalls a story or actual circumstances that take place 100 years earlier in the late 3rd century BCE. What is this great event? It's the translation of the Hebrew Torah into Greek. And there were many translations of the Hebrew Torah in Greek in the ancient world, not just one, but many, many, many. But what ends up becoming the most respected and the most authoritative is the translation known as the Septuagint. Has anyone heard of the Septuagint? Okay, so the Septuagint is, by the early Common Era, is considered the most official, the most widely respected translation of the Torah in the ancient world, so much so that some Greek-speaking Jews are reciting it in synagogue. And we actually have rabbinic texts to talk about how it kind of has a special status. And even the rabbis consider the possibility that reading from the Septuagint can fulfill your commandment, your obligation to read from the Torah if you don't know Hebrew. So it has this kind of special status in the rabbinic imagination. So the letter of Aristeas is a document that's produced in the late 2nd century BC. So let's say the 130s, the 120s, and it's recalling the circumstances in which the Torah is translated in the 220s, so 100 years before, during the reign of a Hellenistic king named Ptolemy II Philadelphus. And we could have a whole course just on this really incredible text, but sadly we can't, or at least this isn't that course. So I just want to selfishly not share my screen because I like to see all of you, and someone can cut in if you have any issues and you don't know where I am. I can, if I need to, I can share my screen, but I'm looking at the first paragraph on the source sheet. The letter of Aristeas is framed as a letter. Probably wasn't actually a letter, but many fictional texts in the ancient world were framed as letters. And so this text, which is written by a Jew, is framed as a text that's written from a Greek to his friend, Philocrates, his friend or his brother. He says brother, but sometimes brother means friend. In Greek, it's kind of not always it's not always like a familial word. So in any case, this text engages in what scholars call pseudepigraphy, from the word pseudo, P-S-E-U-D-O, which means fake, and graphos, which means writings. What do scholars mean when they call this pseudepigraphy? They mean that the Jewish author is masquerading, is disguising himself as a Greek speaker. But scholars all agree this is a Jewish text. There's tons of intimate knowledge of the Septuagint and of Jewish practices and references to dietary laws and all kinds of interesting things that only an insider to Judaism would have really been aware of, but it's framed as one Greek writing to his friend Philocrates about the translation of the Torah. And he opens up with this really interesting scene. He says that before the translation was commissioned, and according to this version, it's commissioned by Ptolemy II Philadelphus for the Great Library of Alexandria. Ptolemy II, this is a fantasy. This is a diasporan fantasy in which Greeks respect diasporan Jews and Judean Jews respect diasporan Jews. So it's total fantasy. It does not mirror reality. It pushes against reality. So this fantasy text imagines Ptolemy to Philadelphus, saying, wow, I respect the wisdom of the Jews so very much, and they have so much to teach us that I'm going to commission the translation of the Hebrew Torah into the best version we can get. We're going to put it into our library. And he sends a letter to the high priest in Jerusalem named Eleazar. And he says, oh, my brother, my best friend, Eleazar, would you do me the great honor of finding 72 scholars to help me translate, Judean scholars, help me translate the Torah? And Eleazar says, of course, my best friend Ptolemy, I love you so much. This is a great idea. And it's just like all hearts and flowers and all positive and no tension. And the opening scene of Arceus is fascinating because in this scene, the Jewish community that is approached to support the translation says to Ptolemy Philadelphus, yes, we will gladly support the project to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. But Philadelphus, Ptolemy, we know that you have tens of thousands of Jewish captives. Through all your wars and all your campaigns in Judea and elsewhere, you've taken all these Jewish captives in war. As a gesture of goodwill to the local Jewish community, please release these captives to show your genuine friendship, and then we'll get started on the translation. And so we have a speech that one of the Jews gives to the king to convince him to release the Jewish captives that he has taken in war. And this is the very, very opening of the book. And the argument that is made to the king is, listen, king, you know, you go on many campaigns and you fight many wars and you capture many people, but the Jews are unique because the Jews and the Greeks are actually very similar. They're not opposite. They don't have opposing cultures. They draw from the same well of wisdom. That's going to be a huge theme in the book. And also they worship the same God. Oh no, I have a typo, but ignore the typo. Go to the fourth line of the first paragraph. Out of your unsullied, this is a speech asking Ptolemy to free the slaves. Out of your unsullied and magnanimous soul, release those who are subject to misery. Do you see my typo? I hope you don't. I wrote ought misery. The same God who appointed them their law prospers your kingdom, right? So the same God that gave the Jews their Torah, and here law is actually not law. Law in Greek, this text is written in Greek. The word is nomos, and we've discussed in previous weeks that nomos is better translated as Torah in many Jewish texts produced at this time. So it really should be translated, the same God who appointed them their Torah prospers your kingdom, makes your kingdom successful, as I've been at pains to show. These people worship God, the creator of all, whom all men worship, including ourselves. All men worship this higher deity, this creator God, this universal God. But we Jews, we have a different name. Your name for him is Zeus. Right? And by the end of the 2nd century BC, Zeus is considered the father god, the highest god, and Greeks are moving towards some kind of polytheistic monotheism, which sounds contradictory, but scholars do talk about how this worked. They're moving towards a system where you have one originator god, and then you have many unseen deities and forces, and so Zeus occupies the highest position of all the gods, and this Jew says, listen, do you ever read a magazine? I think it's People magazine, where they have stars. They're just like us. I don't know what magazine that's in, but Jews, we're just like you, right? You might look at us and think, oh, wow, you're so different. You have circumcision and Sabbath and dietary life. No, we worship the same God. And this is the foundation of the book, that even though Jews have particular laws that they are committed to and they will not surrender, their values are correlative with Greek wisdom, and therefore the Greeks should embrace the Jews. But this text is not just a fantasy about Greek-Jewish relations. It's also a fantasy about how much Jews in the land of Israel love and respect their kin in Egypt. And again, I'm not convinced that this mirrors reality. I think that this is someone who really, really wants their Judean kin in Egypt to be embracing them. I don't know that it actually happened, but we have this fantastic letter that King Ptolemy, again, this is all fictional, according to scholars, King Ptolemy sends this letter to Eleazar asking him to participate in the project of translation. That's the next big paragraph I have. and it's incredible expressions of friendship. I didn't include here Elazar's response, which is equally enthusiastic, but I did want to point out the description of Judean scholars that Elazar chooses and sends to Alexandria. There's just some delightful details here. First of all, in the rabbinic tradition, in the Talmud, there are 70 scholars who translate the Septuagint, and of course, Septa in Greek refers to those 70 scholars. But in Letter of Arceus, which is around 7 centuries before the writing down in the Babylonian Talmud, it's not 70, it's 72. And the reason is, Arceus tells us, is because Elazar selected, oh no, I'm bad at math. Is it 6 from each of the 12 tribes? Yeah, 12 times. It's the end of the day. Okay. All right. So 6 from each tribe. And again, this kind of speaks to the element of fantasy in this text, because by the 2nd century BCE, we don't have the tribes, right? The 10 tribes of the northern Israelite kingdom are exiled by Assyria in 722 BC. They are long gone. Whatever Jewish community you have in Egypt likely does not descend from those 10 tribes. So even the idea that there are these 12 tribes and they're all sort of living harmoniously in the land of Israel, this could not have been in the 2nd century BC. But Aristeas is imagining that there are 6 selected from each tribe. And it's possible that since this is the request that Ptolemy makes, that maybe Ptolemy is misunderstanding how the Jews live among one another, and Elazar humors him. He chooses 72 random scholars, but he knows that they're not necessarily from the 12 tribes. In any case, look at this description of the scholars. Elazar selected men of the highest merit and of excellent education due to the distinction of their parentage. So some of their, this is a little classist maybe, or some of their reputation is staked on the fact that they come from impressive families, but they had not only mastered the Jewish literature, they had made a serious study of that of the Greeks as well. So they're walking this tightrope of mastering Jewish tradition and Greek philosophy. So they're well qualified for the embassy. They brought it to fruition as occasion demanded. They had a tremendous natural facility for the negotiations. Oh no, another typo. How did I do that? And questions arising from the Torah. Remember, law is nomos. With the middle way as their commendable ideal, they forsook any uncouth and uncultured attitude of mind. Again, we have to read this as an Egyptian Jewish fantasy of what they want Judean Jews to be. Is it true that Jewish intellectual circles in the land of Israel were producing scholars who were enamored of Greek philosophy and walking the middle way? It almost looks Maimonidean or Aristotelian, right? Walking that golden mean, that middle ground of perfect balance between Jewish ancestral tradition and Greek philosophical tradition. This is all, of course, what the Egyptian Jewish writer wants to imagine his Judean kin are. And so I'm going to move on from Aristeas, but I want to begin with this optimistic notion, then I'll go to Bob in a second, that it's possible, right? It's possible to have a perfect balance between embracing the Hellenistic philosophical world completely and not surrendering or not sort of compromising the integrity of Jewish ancestral tradition. You could, I'm back to cake. I guess I'm very hungry. You could have your cake and eat it too, right? You can be in both worlds and both sides can embrace you rather than being doubly marginal and being rejected by both communities, the Hellenists on one side and the Judean Jews on the other. Aristeas says, no, we could be embraced by both. We could be ambassadors of knowledge of God to the Hellenistic neighbors, and we can bring the wisdom of the Hellenistic world back to our Judean kin. All right, let's go to Bob. Do you have a question?
Was this written for a creative writing class? I mean, what was it? What was the rhetorical purpose? Who saw it? What, I mean, was it published? Was it sent to somebody? Did the Jews in Jerusalem see it? I mean, how did anybody learn of this?
It's a huge question, but it was a very popular text. Um, there are many wonderful scholars on the letter of Aristeas, and I would especially recommend the work of Benjamin Wright, who's written, I believe his first name is Ben Wright. There are a few Wrights in biblical scholarship. There's also Jacob Wright, but I'm pretty sure it's Ben Wright who's written books and books on Aristeas, and others as well. Most scholars believe that this is written for a local Greek-speaking Jewish audience. So again, it's a question that scholars of Aristeas have, but consensus is that the author is writing for Jews who are Greek speakers, right? This is written in very high level Greek. And it's written maybe to encourage Jews who were only reading their scriptures from the Septuagint to feel justified in their level of access to their tradition, right? Don't feel that you're somehow studying a corrupt version of your text, or that you are at a disadvantage because you don't have immediate access to the teachings of the Hebrew tradition. Look, you have this incredible, authoritative, perfect document, and you have the blessing of your Judean kin too. So many scholars read the text as an attempt to justify the legitimacy of the Septuagint. I actually look at it a little more expansively. I don't think it's just about the status, the technical status of the Septuagint. I think that this is a fantasy about how Jews in Egypt are struggling with their various relationships and are imagining something maybe more ideal than what was in front of them. But I think that Jews in Egypt read this, and I think that they were enamored of it. It's a highly cited, popular work. And the question of, well, did they read it literally? Did they think that it happened this way? Was it really history? I mean, this is a bigger question about how history is written in the ancient world, because they're not thinking with the categories of fiction and nonfiction. All histories were a little embellished in the ancient world. All autobiographies were a little, scholars use the word hagiographic, a little exaggerated. So they're not thinking like, oh my gosh, this detail did not exactly happen the way he described. A lot of this is for entertainment value, and I think that the readers appreciated that entertainment value.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a complicated question. So let's move on to Philo of Alexandria. And Philo takes a pragmatic view. I wouldn't call him a total optimist or a total pessimist, but we talked about Philo 2 weeks ago. And so I'll just very briefly refresh your memories. Hold on. Philo, in his own day, is recognized as maybe the most important Jew in Egypt. He comes from a very renowned family. He has a nephew who Marcus marries one of the Herodian princesses who are in Jerusalem. He has a brother-in-law who is an apostate, and he works at a very high level for the Roman Empire. Philo's in a very prestigious Jewish family. And Philo witnesses some terrible anti-Judaism. You'll recall that in 38 CE, there are anti-Jewish pogroms in Alexandria, and Philo goes in this embassy along with 4 other Jewish delegates to Rome, and he appeals to Caligula on behalf of the Jews. Remember that? We talked about that. Yeah, okay, all right. And so Philo is very sensitive to a Roman audience. Right now, we could talk about Rome more than Greece because his years are 20 BCE to around 50 CE. So he's living in Roman Egypt. And Philo writes many, many treatises. Some of these treatises justify the Jewish laws, as in this treatise that I cite called the Special Laws. 2 of them are historical, where he recounts the violence in 38 CE and the aftermath. And some of them are exegetical. They interpret the Torah. And so as you go through Philo, if you're to read Philo, it's very hard to read, you might come to different conclusions about his audience based on what treatise you're reading. So if you're looking at his more interpretive texts, it looks like he's running for a Jewish audience. But some of the more philosophical texts seem to be more defensive of Judaism and perhaps have a Roman audience in mind. Philo does not, in contrast to what many scholars think, Philo does not believe that the Hellenistic wisdom tradition and the Jewish wisdom tradition are equal. He doesn't. He, in my opinion, but I think it's pretty easy to substantiate, Philo believes that the Jewish wisdom tradition is superior to the Hellenistic wisdom tradition, but he wants to show that all that is good about the Hellenistic wisdom tradition is correlative with Jewish teaching. So again, walking that tightrope that the author of Aristeas is walking, but maybe not quite as optimistic, because remember, Philo is an eyewitness to some pretty terrible anti-Jewish violence. I'm not going to do all of these texts with you. You'll see in the first source that Philo offers a rationalistic understanding of Jewish practices. In the sources I gave you, he talks about the law of Sabbath as being a rationalist law. He doesn't really believe that any law that the Jews have has no reason. He gives a reason to pretty much everything. But I want to show you this second paragraph that starts with, "It amazes me." See that? This is in a treatise called The Special Laws, in which he goes through all these laws that are subject to critique by Greeks and Romans, who are saying, this is proof, the dietary laws is proof of the Jews' insularity, and look at how they keep a different calendar, etc. And this is what he says towards the end of the second section of this treatise. He says, "It amazes me that some dare to charge the nation, the Jews, with an antisocial stance. A nation which has made such an extensive use of fellowship and goodwill towards all people everywhere, that they offer up prayers and feasts and first fruits on behalf of the common race of human beings," right? So everyone is accusing the Jews of misanthropia. That's a Greek word, misanthropy. And the Jews have fellowship and goodwill. Yes, they have distinctive practices and distinctive scriptures, but they serve the self-existent God both on behalf of themselves and of others who have run from the services which they should have rendered. These are the things they do for the entire race of human beings. So Philo advocates for a universalist understanding of Jewish ethical values that undercut accusations of Jewish particularism. Can't remember if we did this 2 weeks ago, because we did talk about the anti-Jewish violence in Alexandria, but I don't think we did. Please cut in if we already did this. Philo, he writes 2 treatises about the violence in 38 CE, and one of them is called For Flaccus. Flaccus was a Roman prefect who either stood by silently as the violence took place, or he supported and encouraged it. And Philo, of course, is horrified and appalled by Flaccus's complicity in the violence. And he says, why do you think Jews came to Alexandria in the first place? Well, they came when it was founded. They're just as ancient as anyone else. And the reason why they came at the moment that Alexandria was founded is because no one country can contain the whole Jewish nation by reason of its populousness. Practically speaking, Jews have to live in the diaspora. Now, you in this group, we can debate whether that's compelling, but this is his argument. You simply can't fit all the Jews in Judea, and so they go elsewhere. And not because they're not loyal to Jerusalem or Judea, but as a natural consequence of them living outside the land, they have 2 homes. On the one hand, they have their motherland, the metropolis, right? From the Greek word meter, mother, polis, city. So to look upon the holy city of Jerusalem as their metropolis, their motherland, in which is erected the sacred temple of the Most High God. But, they have a patris, they have a fatherland too. And that fatherland is Rome. Now, what Philo is going to suggest is that Rome, as the fatherland of the Jewish people, has an obligation to protect them. Just as the Jews have a right to live in their fatherland, they can call upon their father to say, you need to protect all your citizens. Now, the question of whether Jews were technically citizens in the Roman Empire is a very complex question, and they're not all Jews were citizens, but putting the technical question of Roman citizenship aside, we are legitimate inhabitants of the Roman Empire. Rome is our fatherland. Rome is responsible for our welfare. And so he says, a counting those regions which have been occupied by the Jews' fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers and still more remote ancestors. Because remember I said in the first week, antiquity is very important to Greeks and Romans. So whoever is the oldest is the most legitimate. And we were here at the very beginning, Philo says. And so counting the place occupied by our oldest ancestors as our country, as our patris, we have a right to live. And then he uses this language of colony. We have a right to live in this colony. But actually what's interesting is that this could throw us off. For Philo, a colony is not a bad thing. Today we think of colonization, we think of this as a very bad thing, but actually he doesn't think of Philo of colonization at all negatively. And he also in other treatises talks about Egyptian and Roman and Greek colonies elsewhere outside or at the edges of the empire. So don't be tripped up by that. But he says there are even some regions to which the Jews came the very moment they were originally settled, sending a colony of their people to do a pleasure to the founders of the colony. So again, colony, not bad. It just means that the Jews sent people from Judea to Alexandria or Egypt the moment that it was founded. So Jews have a legitimate right to live in Egypt or elsewhere in the Roman Empire. And having done so at the moment that these places were founded, they can call upon their host empire as their fatherland to protect them. So it's a pragmatic argument. But he's not fooling himself about, this is not exactly a love affair, right? It's not the love affair we find in Aristeas. Philo is enraged about what has happened to the Jewish people in his community. Enraged. There's a lot here that you could look up on your own, but I want to take you to the paragraph that starts with 370, just before on the confusion of tongues. So scroll down a little. He's talking about kings that preceded Caligula, and he's saying there were not kings, there were emperors, like Tiberius, for example, who protected the Jews from violence and gave them certain formal permission to not attend public festivals to the gods, and also forbade violence against the Jews. Forbade. And so, well, if you see 157, Tiberius never removed the Jews from Rome, nor did he deprive them of their rights as Roman citizens. He had a regard for Judea. And because he had a regard for Judea, the Jews who were colonizing, or who were, I guess, treating other parts of the Roman Empire as colonies of Judea. I mean, it's kind of interesting language, but Tiberius tolerates these Jews wherever they live. But in 38 CE, Alexandria, its Jews are attacked. Synagogues are set on fire. Hundreds of Jews are executed. Thousands more have to flee, or they're hiding in their homes. And he has a very powerful description of this destruction. And he says, now this is at the end of the treatise, after they're basically laughed out of Caligula's court. Philo says, would it not be a terrible thing? Do you see that? It's 5 lines down from 370. Would it not be a terrible thing for the interests of all Jews throughout the whole world to be thrown into confusion by the treatment to which we were exposed? So if you think Philo is being a little full of himself, you're correct, he is. Because according to Philo, Alexandria is the most important Jewish community in the world. It's the most sophisticated, it's the most enlightened, it's the most progressive in terms of its commitment to ancestral law, but willing to embrace Hellenistic philosophical teachings. And so if we are condemned as Jews, you could almost hear echoes of contemporary Jewish catastrophes of like the more enlightened Jews. Well, I don't want to make Holocaust comparisons, but you can sort of see how Philo is reasoning here. We are the most sophisticated Jews. And if we're going to be attacked and oppressed, wouldn't that be confusing to the entire rest of the Jewish world? If Flaccus, the Roman prefect, were to give us up to our enemies, what other city can enjoy tranquility, right? With Alexandria being the most sophisticated of all the cities in the Roman world. What city would there be in which citizens would not attack the Jews living in it? If Alexandria, if the city's leaders tolerate physical violence against Jews, every other city that is less impressive, less sophisticated, less modern will say, all right, well, screw it. If Alexandria says it's okay, then I guess violence of Jews is okay anywhere. What synagogue would be let uninjured? What state will not overturn every principle of justice in respect of those of their countrymen who arrayed themselves in opposition to the national laws and customs of the Jews? The Jews will be overthrown. They will be shipwrecked. They'll be sent to the bottom with all the laws of their nation and those two which are common to all and in accordance with the principles of justice recognized in every city. If you don't do something, Philo says to Caligula, if you allow the Jews to be ostracized and libeled and attacked and persecuted, you are making every Jew in the world, in the Roman Empire and beyond, vulnerable to violence. To me, this is a very resonant passage. This idea that Jews are collectively responsible for one another and also are treated as a collective, right? So if something happens to the Jewish community in one place, then others will say, all right, what's happening there? So now we're going to either take our rage out on the Jews that are local to us, or, some kind of comparative logic that treats all Jews as the same. So Philo is not the optimist of the letter of Aristeas, but he really wants it to work. We have no evidence that he has any interest in relocating to the land of Israel. It seems that he only sees the Jerusalem temple with his own eyes once. He says, I saw the great Jerusalem temple once in my life, and he describes it in magisterial terms. But this is not a pilgrimage that would have been impossible for him. He could have gone 3 times a year on the pilgrimage holidays, but he didn't. He believes in the project. I wouldn't say the diasporan project because he doesn't really use the word diaspora, except when he's citing a biblical verse that has the word diaspora. But he believes in the project of Jewish life outside of the land of Israel. He believes in the idea that Jews outside Judea can be ambassadors of their faith to their neighbors, and they can live in harmony together. That's the pragmatic world of Philo. Any questions? We're about to get a lot darker. I think I'm going to skip Josephus. I mean, I could say a little bit about Josephus, but I want to get to 3 Maccabees. So just, I'll give you 5 more seconds. Any questions for clarity before we go on? All right. I mean, Josephus is a huge topic in and of himself. He's not writing from Egypt. He's writing from Rome. He is sent to Rome as a captive in the Great War, the Great Jewish Rebellion that takes place from 66 CE to 73 CE. And in that war, the temple falls in 70 CE. So he, I think I said this in the first week, is given control of a small, maybe not so small, but a Jewish garrison in the north. And Josephus, who's a young commander in the war, is a terrible general. He just doesn't know what he's doing. Basically, his whole garrison is killed. And there's a famous scene where he's hiding in a cave, and he's in a group of a couple dozen, I don't remember what the number is, but a couple dozen Jews who are hiding, and they know that they can't commit suicide according to Jewish law, so they all decide to kill each other. And then Josephus is left standing by himself, and he's like, well, I can't kill myself because it's against rabbinic law. Oh, well, guess I have to live. There's actually a mathematical riddle something called like Josephus's puzzle. You could find it on Wikipedia. There's a page for it. I don't remember exactly what Josephus's riddle or puzzle, but it's about like what happens if you're in a circle, then you have to move to the right until there's just one. I don't remember what the mathematical question is, but in any case, he's with all these Jews in the cave. They all end up killing themselves or killing the person next to them. He somehow survives. He's taken captive by General Vespasian, who a year later becomes emperor. He's taken captive to Rome, and he lives out his days in Rome. He gets a very bad reputation as a traitor of the Jews, but I did talk about this in the first class. I don't think that he is a traitor, but in any case, the justification that Josephus has for Jewish life outside the land of Israel is quite similar to Philo. And that is simply that practically it's not realistic to expect all Jews to live in the land of Israel, but wherever they live, Jews are loyal to both Jerusalem and their host empire. So again, we have this kind of toggling between both loyalties. He says, let no one wonder that there's so much wealth in our temple. since all the Jews everywhere throughout the habitable earth are sending their contributions to it from very ancient times. This is one of many texts we have that speak to the widespread practice of Jewish philanthropy, or maybe not philanthropy, but Jewish financial support of the Jerusalem temple. That's an interesting detail here. And he is responding to critics who are saying, why are the Jews sending so much money to the Jerusalem temple? We looked at that 2 weeks ago. Cicero and others are complaining that the Jews are sending too much money to Jerusalem. That money should be going to Rome. But I do think that I'm going to I'm going to focus on the darker view because it's already 7:45. So I want to introduce you to 2 texts, 3 Maccabees and the Greek version of Esther, because it brings us back to the world of Egyptian Jewry. And we have so much literature from Egyptian Jews in the late Second Temple period, the 2nd century BC, 1st century BC, and the 1st century CE. So 3 Maccabees is a very obscure text that I think most of us in the Jewish community are not familiar with. It is not about the Maccabees. So we actually have 4 books of Maccabees, 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees, 3 Maccabees, 4 Maccabees. 3 Maccabees and 4 Maccabees have nothing to do with the Maccabees. It's confusing. These 4 works are translated in, or they're preserved in a collection called the Apocrypha, which are works that were preserved as canonical, as authoritative in the Catholic tradition. Actually, some ancient Apocrypha lists do not have 3 Maccabees and 4 Maccabees. Some do, some don't. 1 Maccabees and 2 Maccabees, I discussed this last week, I think. Those are accounts of the Hasmonean rebellion in 167 BC. And of those, only 1 Maccabees is historically reliable. 2 Maccabees was written by a diasporan Jew who was not an eyewitness to the war. So what's 3 Maccabees? And what's 4 Maccabees? So 3 Maccabees is a novella about an existential crisis that takes place in Alexandria, wherein an Egyptian Hellenistic king, Ptolemy Philopator, in the 3rd century BCE, vows to exterminate, to execute all the Jews in his kingdom. You could read this in parallel with 1 and 2 Maccabees, because in a way it's like their very own Hanukkah story, right? It's almost as if the author who wrote this said, yeah, you know, terrible existential things happened to the Jews in Judea and God saved them. And remember the letter last week where Jews in the land of Israel are interpreting that salvation through the lens of diaspora Judea tension. They're saying, look, God only saves those Jews who return to the land of Israel. But then you have 3 Maccabees, and 3 Maccabees is a story about divine salvation in the diaspora. So it's kind of a response maybe to the letters that we saw last week. It's like, let's have our own story about salvation that takes place right here in Alexandria to affirm God's equal care and protection of all Jews wherever they are. But it's also very parallel to the book of Esther, because again, you have a story of the Jews who are living outside the land of Israel, facing this terrible existential crisis and somehow winning the day. So in this story, Philopator is very insulted by Jews who, first in Jerusalem, who don't want him to, he won all these wars. So he wanted to go and celebrate on his way back home from a bunch of wars. He wants to go and celebrate by stopping in Jerusalem and entering into its temple and offering a sacrifice there. But of course, it would be to the gods. And according to 3 Maccabees, again, there could be a kernel of historical truth in this story, but this, as we have it, is a novella. It's a fictional novella. But according to the story, the Jews in Jerusalem, initially they say, of course, you could come into Jerusalem, we welcome you. But then when he announces his intention to go into the temple, they freak out. And they say, no. No one goes into the temple except for the priest, and no one goes into the Holy of Holies except for high priest 1 day of the year. He wanted to go see the Holy of Holies. And so he gets very angry. And he doesn't take out his rage on the Jews of Judea, right? This is one of the big themes that we see in all the texts that we've been looking at, this sense of collective responsibility, collective unity. He goes back to Egypt and he says, I'm going to kill all the Jews here for what your brethren did to me in Jerusalem. They humiliated me. They embarrassed me. They're so particularist. They're so self-serving. I'm going to kill all of you. That's the premise of the book. And he writes this edict declaring his intentions to kill all the Jews. So what I have here on the source sheet is that edict. And he says, we had such great benevolence for the Jews, but they never ceased from their folly. Look at verse 17. The Jews in Jerusalem accepted our presence by word, but insincerely by deed. That is a huge trope in anti-Jewish literature. You see it in early Christian literature, you see it in medieval, you see all through the ages, this anti-Jewish trope of hypocrisy and of pretending to be one thing, but really being another. And so here the Jews, they pretend to be our friends, but that was all insincere. They were carried away by their traditional arrogance. They excluded us from entering the temple. They were spared the exercise of our power because we're so nice to them, right? We're just going to kill all of you in Egypt, right? They were spared the exercise of our power. In other words, I could have killed them on the spot, but I'm so benevolent I didn't. Now I'm just going to kill all of you. Anyway, verse 19. By maintaining their manifest ill will, they became the only people among all nations who hold their head high in defiance of kings and their own benefactors and are unwilling to regard any action as sincere. And so he goes, now he turns his attention to those who are in his, under his Egyptian jurisdiction. Hold on. So he says, the Jews in verse 22, they have innate malice, right? They disdain what is good. They incline constantly to evil. They spurn the priceless citizenship. That historically is probably not true. I think most Jews in the ancient world wanted citizenship, but they didn't want the obligations of citizenship if it included mandatory attendance at the festival. They abominate those few among them who are sincerely disposed towards us. That means the people who assimilated. In every situation, they secretly suspect that we may soon alter our policy. Therefore, fully convinced by these indications that they are ill disposed towards us in every way, we've taken precautions so that we shall not have these impious people behind our backs as traitors and barbarous enemies. This is the letter he's writing to his citizens in Egypt. So, collect all the Jews. It reads a lot like Esther. Together with their wives and children, verse 25, bind them securely with iron fetters, suffer the sure and shameful death that befits enemies. And so he gathers all the Jews in the hippodrome. Hippo in Greek means horse. This is where they would have their horse racing. They would have all kinds of fighting with animals and all kinds of big spectacles. And they gather the Jews in the hippodrome, and they feed wine to elephants. They make the elephants drunk, and they think that the Ptolemy and his cohort think that they're going to release the drunken elephants into the hippodrome and they'll trample all the Jews. This is the story. But miraculously, the elephants do nothing, and then there's a chaos that leads to the trampling of their enemies. I mean, it's kind of like a very pat form story where the enemies of the Jews are the ones in the end who are in a state of confusion and chaos, and the Jews are saved. And so when Ptolemy, this is not in your source sheet, but when Ptolemy sees what God has done for the Jews, he immediately declares the Jewish God to be great and worthy of his respect. So that's 3 Maccabees. But the attitude that the author of 3 Maccabees has towards the Hellenistic king who rules Egypt is totally different from the letter of Aristeas, right? Here you have 2 works that are both written in the vicinity of Alexandria, probably the late 2nd century BCE, or maybe the early 1st century BCE. 2 observant Jews who likely kept Sabbath, dietary laws, and circumcision, and yet they've totally opposing views towards whether the Jewish people who live in this community can be fully integrated into their broader host society. And the author of 3 Maccabees is extremely pessimistic that Jews can successfully integrate and be embraced by their Hellenistic brethren. You see this view again in a Greek version of the Hebrew Book of Esther. Hebrew Book of Esther was written in Greek in a number of versions. And one of those versions of Greek Esther, there's an edition that was produced by a Jew living in Egypt. And this edition is the text of the edict that the king sends out, giving his 127 provinces permission to kill the Jews. So we know the story of Esther, right? More or less, where in chapter 3, Haman instigates this this plan to kill all the Jews and convinces Ahasuerus. In Greek, it's a different king. It's not Ahasuerus, it's Artaxerxes. But in any case, in Esther chapter 3, we don't actually have the cited edict. We don't have the content of the edict itself. We have kind of a paraphrase of what it says. But in the Greek version, we have the content of the edict, and it looks almost identical to the letter of Philopator in 3 Maccabees. So now we have two, maybe not identical, but two very similar texts produced in Greek by a Greek-speaking Jew in the 2nd century BCE that imagines an edict produced by a Hellenistic king insisting on the execution of his Jewish subjects. And again, the description of the Jews in this addition to Greek Esther borrows from all the tropes that we've already seen in other places. That if you go to the 3rd paragraph on the 6th line, we understand that this people and it alone stands constantly in opposition to every nation, perversely following a strange manner of life and laws. You have a little bit of this in Esther chapter 3, but this is an expansion of it. They're ill disposed to our government. They do all the harm they can so that our kingdom may not attain stability. And so you have, in this addition to the book of Esther and in 3 Maccabees, the notion that Jews are in existential peril outside the land of Israel and really don't belong and cannot expect to ever fully integrate because they will never be totally accepted by their Hellenistic neighbors. So you have a very wide spectrum of attitudes when it comes to diasporan Jewish life, everything ranging from it can all work out and be as hunky-dory as you can imagine, with our Judean kin embracing and loving us and our Hellenistic neighbors doing the same, all the way up to we're living in existential peril and we are dependent on God and only God for intervention and protection at all times. Now, what's the upshot? I mean, I'd like to leave a couple minutes for a conversation, not just about what we discussed tonight, but also previous classes. But the upshot is, I think that if there's one thing that maybe brings these texts together, it's that the Jews do not retreat in the face of criticisms. Now, they respond to these criticisms coming from various directions in different ways, but they take pride in their distinctive identities. And we have very little evidence, I would say, of extreme assimilation in this society, in which it would have been quite easy for Jews to just shed their ancestral laws and totally assimilate into that Hellenistic world. It doesn't seem that most of them did, or to say conversely, a critical mass of them did not. So whereas I think sometimes when we talk about the holiday of Hanukkah or history in general, we kind of imagine that Jews in this very early diaspora in the Hellenistic world tended to be Hellenized, tended to be more assimilated, and just sort of practice, if they practice at all, a kind of corrupted version of their ancestral laws. That actually does not seem to be the case. These were Jews who were deeply proud of their ancestral tradition. Now, they argued about how to interact with their neighbors, and maybe they argued about how to cultivate a relationship with their kin in Judea. But I think where they agreed is that they had to lean in to their Jewish identity, to respond to these criticisms, to take agency, to take their futures into their own hands, and in some cases, to borrow the best from both worlds and cultivate a totally new identity. So with it being 8 o'clock on the dot, I would be glad to open things up to maybe comments or questions, and then we'll go to Rabbi Geffen. Wow, I answered every question. That's great. But it's a lot to take in, and so that's why I gave you my email. If you have any questions, you can always reach out. All right, maybe we'll go to Rabbi Geffen for some final words.
first, as always, anytime I get to be in a room where Dr. Simkovich is teaching, I walk away enriched and enlightened, a little depressed, but also enriched and enlightened. And I just am struck by, I'm struck by the timeliness of this conversation. Who would have thought that a conversation about Second Temple Judaism could be a timely conversation? And yet, the old is new or the new is old or something like that. So, Dr. Simkovich, on behalf of all of us, thank you. Thank you for teaching our community, and thank you so much, really, I think more importantly, for all you do and everyone you teach and anyone lucky enough to kind of be in your galaxy and the orbit. They are enriched by your presence. And to our friends here who've been a part of this Nachman series, we just want to thank you for taking the time out of your lives to be enriched, to learn, to be challenged, and now to walk away with a deeper context and a place and time in modernity for deep consideration about that. And as we have members of the Nachman family here, our gratitude just forever to you for this presence of what has been an incredible gift to our congregation over many, many years, established by two incredible people no longer with us physically, but Rosalind and Adolf Nachman, their legacy lives on every time we learn in these series. And one of the best things they did was simply require learning with great teachers. And it's really made this series in any year it has appeared something pretty incredible. So really, Kathy, Bob, thank you for your family's presence in making this possible, and thanks to you all. We wish you a good night, a safe night, and we'll hope to see you soon wherever you are, maybe even embodied off of the screen. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Rabbi Geffen.
Yeah, thanks so much. I thought it was great. I learned oodles of stuff.
Well, thank you so much for your support. And it was great to meet you. Really appreciate it.